But first, that wild story that tangles up the world's richest man, America's most famous tabloid, a longtime friend turned witness against President Trump, maybe even the rulers of Saudi Arabia. It all began last month when the National Enquirer published text messages between Amazon's founder Jeff Bezos and his mistress, Lauren Sanchez. A revelation that Bezos, who also owns the Washington Post, tried to preempt by announcing the end of his marriage. Then late this week, Bezos went public again, writing on Medium that agents for the National Enquirer and its parent company, AMI, threatened to release additional texts and explicit photos unless Bezos said publicly that the Enquirer story about him was, quote, not politically motivated. Instead of bowing to the demand, Bezos lashed back. Of course, I don't want personal photos published, but I also won't participate in their well-known practice of blackmail, political favors, political attacks, and corruption. Bezos is also investigating why he was a target of the Enquirer. And his post references AMI chairman David Pecker's close friendship with President Trump and the Washington Post coverage of Jamal Khashoggi's murder by operatives tied to the Saudi crown prince. Quote, an AMI leader advised us that Mr. Pecker is apoplectic about our investigation. For reasons still to be better understood, the Saudi angle seems to hit a particularly sensitive nerve. Federal prosecutors are now reviewing the Bezos accusations, which could jeopardize AMI's existing immunity deal, in which the company admitted to quashing damaging stories about Trump to help his presidential campaign. That is some of the background. Here to respond, David Pecker's attorney, Elkim Abramowitz. Thank you for joining us.
Morning, George.
This morning, right out there, Jeff Bezos says extortion, blackmail.
It absolutely is not extortion and not blackmail. What happened was the story was given to the National Enquirer by a reliable source that had given information to the National Enquirer for 7 years prior to this story. It was a source that was well known to both Mr. Bezos and Ms. Sanchez.
Was it Michael Sanchez?
I can't discuss who the source was. It's confidential within AMI, so I'm not going to answer who the source was. It was somebody close to both Bezos and Ms. Sanchez.
Let me show some of the correspondence that Mr. Bezos published. He had this was a letter from AMI's lawyer John Fine, the deputy counsel, and it lays out two of the conditions he was setting. One, a public acknowledgments from the Bezos parties that they have no knowledge or basis for suggesting that AMI's coverage was politically motivated or influenced by political forces. And then point three, AM agrees not to publish, distribute, share, or describe unpublished texts and photos. That seems like a pretty clear offer. AMI won't publish these photos if they get this statement from Bezos.
George, you have to understand the context. The story was already out. And there were
not the photos.
Not those photos. I think there were some photos that were in the original story. I think both Bezos and AMI had interests in resolving their differences. Bezos didn't want another story written about him or those pictures published. AMI did not want to have the libel against them that this was inspired by the White House, inspired by Saudi Arabia, or inspired by the Washington Post. It had nothing to do with it. It was a usual story that that National Enquirer gets from reliable sources.
The National Enquirer believes that these photos were newsworthy. Yet they're offering there not to publish them in return for a thing of value from Jeff Bezos, letting go of the legal liabilities, saying that it wasn't politically motivated. How is that not extortion?
That is not extortion because all that AMI wanted was the truth. Bezos and Ms. Sanchez knew who the source was. Any investigator that was going to investigate this knew who the source was. It was not the White House. It was not Saudi Arabia. And the libel that was going out there slamming AMI was that this was all a political hatchet job sponsored by either a foreign nation or somebody politically in this country. That is something that, and the story was already published. It's a news decision to decide how long you can go with the same story, so that each side, it was part of a legitimate negotiation. Each side had something that they wanted.
A source close to those conversations, familiar with those conversations, says this was a crime, not a negotiation.
The source is totally wrong. It's absolutely not a crime to ask somebody to simply tell the truth. Tell the truth that this was not politically motivated, and we will print no more stories.
If you don't say what you want us to say, we're going to publish these photos.
That's not it's part of a negotiation. Look, it's a news decision to decide how many times you're going to write the same story. The story was already out there. I think people misunderstand that this was a post-publication negotiation to resolve any of the outstanding issues. AMI was being blamed.
The clear threat was that there would be a new story coming.
The clear threat from Bezos' point of view is that we're going to link you to Saudi Arabia. We're going to say that you hacked all of these texts. We're going to slander the publication as much as we can. So that's why lawyers sit down and lawyers negotiate to try to resolve differences. That's exactly what this was. How
is that journalism, though? If you believe the photos are newsworthy, how is it journalism to say we're not going to publish this if you give us something we want?
Is it journalism to decide not to print the story 3 times? If the story was out there, there may be a different argument if we were talking about prior to the first publication, where hypothetically somebody could say, you give me $1 million and we won't publish this. That's not what this is. The story was already there. And then the issue was how much wasn't printed in the first story. You can make journalistic decisions as to how many times you're going to write the same story. That's not the job of the prosecutors or anybody else to determine.
You said the source is someone who's been a reliable source to AMI, also close to Ms. Sanchez. Jeff Bezos' security consultant, Gavin DeBecker, has publicly named Michael Sanchez, the brother of Lauren Sanchez, as a possible target of his investigation. Now, Michael Sanchez is a vocal supporter of President Trump, an acquaintance of Roger Stone and Carter Page, and he told the Washington Post reported that he was told by multiple people at American media that the National Enquirer set out to do, quote, a takedown to make Trump happy. Is that true? It's
not true. This was a source that had been giving information to the National Enquirer for 7 years. It was a person that was known to both Bezos and Ms. Sanchez, therefore giving his information more credibility, and that's exactly what happened.
You're not denying that it's Michael Sanchez, and Michael Sanchez told the Washington Post that the National Enquirer set out to do a takedown to make Trump happy. That's what he was told by people at American media.
I'm not going to comment on what Michael Sanchez said. I'm not permitted to tell you or confirm or deny who the source is. I can tell you it's not Saudi Arabia, it's not President Trump, it's not Roger Stone, but I cannot tell you who the sources.
Up on page 2 of the program, we showed that piece from Jeff Bezos' post where he said that an AMI leader advised us that Mr. Pecker is apoplectic about our investigations for reasons still to be better understood. The Saudi angle seems to hit a particularly sensitive nerve. And I just want to run through some of the timeline here. Back in July 2017, David Pecker was at the White House with a man named Casey Grine, who's a Saudi advisor, an advisor to the Saudi royal family. I think we have a picture of Mr. Grine there in the Oval Office back in the summer of 2017. That picture comes from something that AMI published in March 2018, a 100-page glossy about the virtues of Saudi Arabia. Printed 200,000 copies. And then on basically the same day that the Jeff Bezos piece was published, AMI closed on a $450 million restructuring of its debt. Did any of that money come from Saudi Arabia?
Zero.
Not a penny?
Not a penny.
So it
never has. AMI sought financing from the Saudis, but never obtained any, doesn't have any Saudi Arabian financing.
Well, why did AMI National Enquirer, David Pecker, publish this 100-page glossy about Saudi Arabia?
That's a journalistic decision that they made. There's nothing illegal about it, nothing to do with anything that this investigation is about.
Not an attempt.
It was published in March of 2018.
Not an attempt to curry favor with Saudi Arabia?
Not that I'm aware of, and it was published. There were journalistic reasons for publishing it that have nothing to do with any of what we're talking about.
Do you know how it did? It's $13.50 a copy. It's a pretty steep price.
I really don't know. I didn't buy it, but I don't know.
Ronan Farrow and others have come out since the Jeff Bezos post with a number of charges about AMI as well. Here was Ronan Farrow saying, I and at least one other prominent journalist involved in breaking stories about the National Enquirer fielded similar stop digging or will ruin you blackmail efforts from AMI. Ted Bridus of the AP. We were warned explicitly by insiders that AMI had hired private investigators to dig into the backgrounds of AP journalists. The Daily Beast, in the process of reporting the Bezos stories, the Daily Beast and a member of its staff were threatened by AMI's attorney. This seems like a pattern of practice, according to those journalists.
I've never heard of any of those allegations. I am not aware of any attempts by employees of AMI to blackmail or to commit any crime at all.
Are you worried at all that these revelations have put the cooperation agreement of Mr. Pecker with the Southern District in jeopardy?
Absolutely not. We have an agreement with an understanding with the Southern District. I can't comment on it. I am not concerned that any of this...
They've spoken to you since this came out?
I'm not going to comment on any contacts with the Southern District.
Another billionaire, Peter Thiel, brought down Gawker. Are you worried at all that Jeff Bezos will bring down the National Enquirer?
I really can't comment on that. We just want Bezos to acknowledge the results of that investigation, which will show that politics had nothing to do with the story. It was a typical National Enquirer story.
Mr. Abramowitz, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I want to bring in our legal panel right now, our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, also Alan Dershowitz, Harvard Law professor, emeritus, and author of The Case Against the Democratic House Impeaching Trump. Dan, your reaction, what are we seeing here?
Well, look, there are a number of issues here. First of all, you hear Mr. Abramowitz talking about the fact that the story was already out there. That's not the question. We know that the story was already out there. The pictures weren't out there. So the question is, was this a clear threat to say, unless you say what we want you to say, we're going to publish these photos that you don't want out there? So saying that the story's out there doesn't really change the discussion. And then he says, well, we just wanted the truth. Well, the way you get the truth is, you can go back and forth. You can say, look, we think that what you're saying is untrue and libelous and we'll sue you, et cetera. But it gets close. It gets close to this edge. Look, my position is this is kind of extortion-y. It's kind of blackmail-y. But it may not necessarily be the legal definition of extortion or blackmail.
Alan, is there a First Amendment defense here?
There is. The First Amendment needs breathing room. This is a fight between two media moguls. There was a negotiation. It was a tough negotiation. I'm certainly not here to defend the journalistic ethics of the National Enquirer, but the First Amendment doesn't distinguish between the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC News, and the National Enquirer. The First Amendment needs breathing room. You remember Adlai Stevenson once famously said to one of his opponents, if you promise to stop telling lies about me, I will promise to stop telling the truth about you. You need breathing room here, and I agree with Dan that you need to draw a line between what is extortion-ish and what is extortion consistent with the First Amendment.
Okay, you guys Okay, you guys are both the lawyers, so I'm hesitant to practice one on television, but I did look at the code. And Dan, let me start this with you. I mean, the Code Against Extortion says basically you can't threaten something in return for something of value. Right. Renouncing the legal claims, giving a public statement in support, saying it wasn't politically motivated, isn't that a thing of value? Yeah,
look, it could be, and they, you could argue that it was a threat. But it's not that clear, right? It's right on that line where prosecutors are going to evaluate, was this actually a threat, and was this a thing of value? But I'll say in response to what Alan is talking about the First Amendment, look, extortion is always about words. And, typically when someone extorts someone else, they're using words. You don't say, well, nothing that I say can be deemed to be a crime. There are crimes based on words, and that's what extortion is.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that we're dealing with media here. And remember, too, that the alleged extortion occurred in a letter from a lawyer. I've been practicing law for over 50 years. I've never seen an extortion come in the form of a letter from the lawyer.
Actually, but even if that's actually not. I think if there was going to be extortion here, it would actually be the letter from the chief content officer
you don't get
of
extortion
AMI,
where he laid out.
where he laid out.
You don't get extortion by mail. But I think the important thing is not whether the statute could be construed to make this extortion. It's whether the First Amendment would permit that. And I think it's very important to give the First Amendment the kind of breathing room. This is not the first time in our history this has happened. Do you remember the story of Thomas Jefferson and James Callender? James Callender was the National Enquirer of 1800 and constantly was engaged in threats. He threatened Jefferson, he threatened Adams, but we had a First Amendment, Callender and Sedition Act, and Jefferson then pardoned him. We have to give breathing room to the First Amendment. When there are any doubts about whether extortion applies, you resolve those doubts in favor of freedom of the press. Let Bezos fight and argue in the public. Let him release his posts. Let the other side argue. But let's not get prosecutors investigating how journalists operate, because that endangers the freedoms under the First Amendment.
Yeah, but the fact that that American media is a media entity does not immunize them from the types of crimes we're talking about here. Again, I'm not saying that it is a crime, but I'm saying this notion that because it's a fight between two media entities, therefore it means that the laws are different. Just doesn't make any sense to me.
It does mean that the laws are different.
Not when it comes to letters to one another in terms of threatening. No, it doesn't.
It does. Let me tell you why. For example, if the newspapers stole materials and published them like WikiLeaks or any of the other things, if any of us did that, we might be guilty of crimes. But when journalists do it, there is a certain exemption that applies under the First Amendment. So you have to look at every statute on the books, and you have to ask yourself, how does this fit into the theory of breathing room under the First Amendment? Justice Brennan always wrote about breathing room and how you have to interpret statutes narrowly when it comes to First Amendment concerns. When you have a media that is publishing material, then you have to ask yourself the question, what precedent will this have? Because today it's the National Enquirer. Tomorrow, it could be the New York Times or ABC News.
Well, when the
precedents established on bad guys get applied to good guys. That's why we need to rigorously apply the First Amendment.
That's true, except when the New York Times and ABC News start threatening to publish nude pictures, you know, it does then say, is this really a journalistic entity anymore?
Well, I have been threatened on numerous occasions by journalists who say, unless you give me an interview, unless you give me a response to this, we will publish this, we will publish that. Hardball threats by journalists are fairly common today, and particularly by journalists like the National Enquirer. You don't want to put the National Enquirer out of business. It was not a good day for the First Amendment when Gawker was put out of business. And it wouldn't be a good day for the First Amendment if the National Enquirer were put out of business.
We're out of time, but I just have to ask you one more question. Doesn't it change this at all? Doesn't the fact that the National Enquirer agents of the National Enquirer admitted in that Southern District Cooperation Agreement that they were acting as agents, not as journalists, but as agents of President Trump, doesn't that color this at all?
You can be both. You can both be, you know, a lot of newspapers were started as party newspapers for particular political parties. So you can both be an agent, if that's true, and you can also be exercising your First Amendment rights as a person of the media.
But you don't want to be an agent of someone and committing a potential crime in that context. That's a very different scenario.
But the question is, does the First Amendment permit
The First Amendment
crime?
doesn't protect crimes, Alan. It doesn't protect against crime.
The First Amendment construes what a crime means. It helps interpret whether or not a statute is criminal, and you resolve all doubts in favor of the First Amendment. You started out, Dan, by saying this was ambiguous.
It is.
That's the end of the inquiry. If it's ambiguous and we have a First Amendment, prosecutors shouldn't be looking into this and hurting the First Amendment.
They should be looking into it, and we'll see what they decide.
And it clearly is not the end of the debate. Thank you guys for those lively contributions. When we come back...